Well, thank you, Mark, for that wonderful, kind introduction. Looking forward to sharing God's Word with you this morning. I'm just trying to get my bearings in this new experience with the lights and the context here. Okay, today we're going to talk about a very difficult subject, Yahweh war, holy war. And I want to stay at the beginning here, not to confuse this with the mess that we see in the world scene today, like jihad. This is different than that. This is the true God. This is bringing true justice. This is bringing true righteousness. And so I want to say at the beginning just to point that out. But let's start by looking at this class description. It's kind of going to guide where we're going to be looking at both today and in 2 weeks from now. When Mark asked me to write up a description, took some time to think through what I want to unpack about this. This is a big subject. It would take, you could actually do an entire course on holy war. So understand today it's going to be a little bit like a fire hydrant, but even at that point, there's a lot more that can be covered. So just to kind of set that up. And also I want to say, in teaching, I also want to note being in front of the church is one thing, but here in this context, feel free to raise questions and ask. I want to engage. That's, for those of you who've been in my classes, you know that I want my students to engage. So look forward to that. Well, let's take a look at this description. So the presence of holy war passages in the Old Testament has led some to question the character of God and the Old Testament. And we see that in our culture even today, right? Some people don't even want to deal with the Old Testament, like the God of the Old Testament, he's not the same God of the New. I wrestle with this often with my classes at Lancaster. Students come in to the Old Testament classes, and what relevance is this to us? Why is it important? And then they have to deal with God is portrayed in the Old Testament. I don't like the character of God in the Old Testament. So we try to unpack that in a semester. But want to address that. And then think about how should Christians understand holy war passages in the Bible? There are several of them. How should we understand them correctly? What do they reveal about God? And I want to connect for a moment back to what Pastor Mark spoke a couple weeks ago about who God is, right? And we're going to look today at that second half of the definition in Exodus 34. With God being a just God and will not overlook the sin and evil. So we're going to look at that aspect. So we have to understand this to be full understanding who God is. What do these passages reveal about the human condition? This is something that our culture today does not understand. We think humanity is basically good. In the scriptures, we find out that's not the case. Humanity is basically evil. And by God's grace, do we perform goodness? Do we have a righteous intention? And we're seeing how God is going to respond to that. So what do they reveal about God's plan of redemption? Because praise be to God, he hasn't left us in that condition. He could have. We ruined his creation. We pushed back on him. But in his grace, he begins his plan of redemption and to restore us to who he wants us to be. So we need to look at this from that aspect as well. So this 2-week course will explore the answers to these questions through a careful study of the background, message, and theology of the Holy War passages. So let me give you an overview of where we're heading, okay? Today we're going to do background. So we're really going to get into Holy War, some specific texts, and really what people struggle with next class, dealing with the conquest. But today we want to look at the background. We need to understand some things of what God has given us in his word about who he is, his character, what he's doing in the world, bringing judgment on sin and bringing redemption and salvation to humanity who turn to him. So we'll look at the Noahic covenant first. Then we want to look at the Abrahamic covenant. We have to understand the backdrop there. What God is doing with bringing people into the land of Israel, what we're going to look at next time with Holy War, is rooted in his covenant with Abraham and what his work is to bring redemption for the entire world. So we want to look at the Abrahamic covenant in brief today. And then finally, the Exodus, which sometimes people don't think about this, but the Exodus is holy war. This is God's Yahweh war upon Pharaoh and upon the Egyptians and upon the Egyptian gods. And we're going to take a look at that today. So that's where we're headed today. Next time, we're going to go look at the conquest and look at what God is doing through bringing his people into the promised land and actually instructing them to bring about holy war in the land. And then following up with, we're going to take some time to look at the second advent, what Pastor Mike talked about a few weeks ago. But zeroing in, there's holy war coming again. And God's going to come, Christ is coming back. And that second advent is not coming back as the meek one lowly riding on a donkey. He's coming back on a white horse, and that's a military horse. And he's coming back with a sword. And those who are opposing him, those who are wicked, will be judged at that moment. So we'll look at that in 2 weeks, but where we're headed. So we're going to look at the whole spectrum of the Bible here, but be selective. Okay? So any questions at the start? That's a lot, even start where we're started so far. Okay, let's move in to the background. The Noahic covenant. One thing that I'm discovering more and more each semester that I teach on the Torah, the first 5 books, is more and more the students, even Christian students coming to Lancaster Bible College, is that they are unaware of God's expectation of capital punishment on the evildoer who has taken another person's life, the murderer. So I want to look here at the Noahic covenant, and we see here in Genesis 9:6. You need to read the entire passage to see the whole context. But today I want to zero in on 9:6. There's this phrase, as God is restoring the covenant with Noah after the flood, he says this, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image." So this links back to creation. And what I'm trying to do here is understand this idea of judgment, about bringing justice in the world. We see here that God is delegating to humanity, through human government, through a proper means, to bring those evildoers to account. Notice that. Whoever sheds the blood of man, what are we talking about here? Someone who murders another human, someone who takes the life of another human. This passage is describing that God is delegating to humanity, by the hand of man shall his blood be shed. So God is delegating that authority to humanity here. Now people are like, well, this is Old Testament. Yes, it's Old Testament, but notice this. This is before God begins his plan with Israel. This text, if you look at the whole passage, we see that this text is addressed to all humans, right? After the flood, after God brings about judgment on the wickedness of humanity by sending the flood, wiping out everybody on the planet except for Noah and his family and 2 of every kind of unclean animals and 7 of the clean, he establishes his covenant after the flood with Noah and his descendants and with all creatures. And centerpiece of that text is what? The delegation of justice to humanity. I want to start there. We good so far with this? You see where I'm going? God is the one that has the right to take life because he's creator, he's God. But as a way to address the wickedness in the world, God has delegated to humanity the role, the responsibility of bringing the perpetrator to account and bringing the death penalty on the perpetrator. Now, why? Why does God say that killing another human is a capital offense? Image of God. When you attack another human, you're attacking God. How so? Because each and every human is created as God's image and has value. And for me to attack another human is attacking God. That's very important to see here at the beginning. Again, our culture today doesn't doesn't get this and doesn't understand that. But God's laying out this is there. Now, we don't have time today to lean into all this, but the rest of the Old Testament lays out these laws about how you will bring a person to account justly. This isn't willy-nilly. This isn't a mess like what's been happening even in our world. One thing, maybe climb out another thing about the death penalty is this. Today, what people really have a problem with the death penalty is this issue. It's not equitably meted out in a fallen world, right? If you can look online, you can find a lot of stories where people have used this to oppress another people group or what. God's ways, God's law specifically explains how it is that would be brought about. One thing is it must be established on witnesses. You can't just have hearsay. You have to have more than one person that has seen the event and will testify to this in court. Okay? Questions? Yes?
That it's okay to kill another person. Where does that fall in line with God's Ten Commandments, I shall not kill?
Right, and there, thou shalt not kill is really thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not. Oh, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Right. So could you request the question, ask the question one more time so I can remember it too, sorry.
Okay, it says here in Genesis that whomever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. Well then, how does that fall in line with God's one of his Ten Commandments, I shall not kill? It's kind of contradictory, each
Right, thank you. Okay, so the question is that how does this text, Genesis 9:6, align or not contradict the sixth commandment of the Ten Commandments, which says, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not kill. And again, how to answer that question is, the sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill, is the taking of life unlawfully. Murdering, taking an innocent life, taking someone's life just because road rage or what have you. It's not execution. Let me put it this way. The sixth commandment does not say, thou shalt not execute. That's a misunderstanding often, that really going back to the King James Version, because it says, thou shalt not kill. Well, if we take that way, that translation, that means I can't kill an animal, that I can't kill animal for a life, for food or something like that. But that's not what this is getting at, because even here, God permits the taking of animal life for food. So does that answer your question?
It does.
Yeah. And thank you for raising that question, because that's one of the big issues that people wrestle with today. How does this line up with the two? So one is the taking of a life unjustly. The other one is taking of a life in punishment for the injustice done to another individual, of taking their life, robbing their life. Yeah. Thank you. Yes?
How does that play out in war?
So how does that play out in war? We're going to get to this. That's where we're heading. And thank you for that question, because that helps me then unpack further why I'm going to this text. Because again, people will have issues with, for example, God taking out the human population in the flood, or even what he does with at the time of the Exodus. But where the real issue is whenever God is ordering his people to take the life of another human or groups of people. But in order to get there, we need to start with this basis, the theology undergirding this. Does that make sense?
I have a question real quick.
Yeah.
Are there exceptions ever made though? Because I know before this, there was the story of Cain and Abel, and he didn't.
Yes.
So how then do you determine, because he even kind of made exceptions then for his.
Great question. So the question is, what about the exceptions that are in Scripture, correct? Like, for example, Cain, who God allows to live after he takes unjustly his brother's life. Great question. Actually, how I respond to that is this. This is before the flood that happened. And so let me point out this. God doesn't desire to take out people. As tough as this topic is, and God does bring about justice by removing people's lives, yet that's not what he revels in, and he doesn't enjoy to do it. So back to your question about Cain, there are consequences that are put on Cain for his sin, but him allowing him to live was grace. But what happened with that grace? The sad thing is, Cain departed from God's presence and went out and built a whole civilization against God. And if you track that line, what we see is there's where the mess in humanity really started to just flourish in a bad way, which led to what? The flood. So actually, great question. How I see it is this text, God is giving this order and delegating to humanity to head off the mess that happened with Cain, allowing him to continue and not repent, but bring about a ruination to the world. Does that make sense? The line of Cain, this is where you first have polygamy introduced. This is the line that is completely against God's ways, and then it brings ruin and ultimately brings God to the point he looks at humanity and all they've done is corrupted themselves, and he breaks his heart. He breaks his heart. I have to judge. It's not that he wants to do. Even whenever he does that, he waits 120 years before he brings the flood. As Mark was pointing out a couple weeks ago, God is slow to anger, right? I got a little bit off of your question, but there. So there is grace that God does give, but there are consequences. I mean, I think also in Paul in the New Testament, he was murdering Christians. But then also note, whenever Paul becomes saved, and Paul's going to meet one of the religious leaders, and God tells that religious leader what? He will see how much he's going to suffer for my name's sake because of what he's done in the past. Thank you. Okay, let's, yeah, go ahead.
One more question,
Sure.
from me anyhow. So, commandment says, thou shalt not kill. Okay? So, we're using Genesis 9:6 in the Old Testament to support that commandment. Is there text in the New Testament
Yes.
that is going to support?
Excellent question.
Because if you just take the commandment, thou shalt not kill, you expanded on that,
Mhm.
but on what basis?
Mhm.
What in the New
Yeah,
Testament
thank you.
supports?
So the question is there New Testament support for the continuation of the death penalty into the New Testament? Is that basically your question?
Yes.
Right? Yes. Romans 13. Romans 13. And the Romans 13 passage, we need to really lean into that a bit. Paul is talking about the Roman government, that they don't bear the sword in vain. Sword, meaning what? Execution, judgment, justice. And Paul is saying this about the Roman government that's ultimately going to take his life for his testimony of Jesus Christ. Yet Paul says they don't bear the sword in vain, and he describes the human government as what? God's servant. So I'd point you to looking at that text, write it down in your notes, look at Romans 13. That's a tough text. Get ready when you read through it. It's a tough text. But it's God's way of bringing about justice, and it's actually grace, so that the world doesn't become a complete disaster and mess. So he's delegated to humanity to deal with the perpetrators. Again, he's expecting justice, and it's not twisted to a person's benefit. Oh, thank you. Okay. So here I have this point. God expects humanity to rule with justice, which includes capital punishment for murderers. Next, when we look at the sign of the Noahic covenant, what does God say? He's going to set his bow in the cloud. Right? Your text probably says rainbow. That's not what it says in the Hebrew. It's keshet. It's bow. What God is showing is I'm hanging my bow as like I'm done with slaughtering humanity for the wickedness. This is war imagery. So when you look at the bow, the rainbow the next time, think of this. Okay? This is a weapon. But again, God is wanting to be at peace with humanity. Nevertheless, as we learn from Exodus 34, God is a God of justice and righteousness, and he will bring people to account. Okay, moving on. So I'm looking at my time. All right, Abrahamic covenant. We really need to understand this in order to understand God's plan of redemption and what he's doing through Israel, and ultimately how he's going to differentiate Israel for his purposes to bring about blessing for all nations. So here in Genesis 12, 1 through 3, God shows up to Abraham, this pagan moon-worshiping person, and says to him, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." Okay? This is foundational for what God is doing with Israel. And we can boil it down to three things. Land, God is promising Abraham land for him and his descendants to dwell in, to manage, to steward. Seed or descendants, offspring. Remember, Abram and Sarah do not have children at this time. But God is going to bring children through them. He's going to make the womb that's barren fruitful. He's going to bring children through Sarah. And through this line, God is going to bring then blessing. And I really want to unpack blessing, because today I think we misunderstand what blessing is as well. Blessing is, we have to understand the source of blessing. The source of blessing is God. And here God has made himself known to Abraham, and now, just like we learned in the sermon this morning, we're to take that message out. And God is giving Abraham the responsibility here. You need to be a blessing. Go out, make the world know about me. And part of that, by the way, is bringing about justice and righteousness, which we're going to see in a bit here too, that God's going to unpack that, or God's going to expect that of Abraham. So blessing, relationship with God. It's shalom, good Hebrew word. Peace, prosperity, health, that idea. Where do you get that? Being in right relationship with God. And God is bringing that about through Abraham. So it's through him that God's going to make himself known, and he begins his plan of what? Bringing restoration, redemption for the entire world. Look back here again. What does it say? Some? All families. So we have to remember that in light of these texts that are difficult, as we see God bringing judgment on the wicked, his intention is not to bring judgment on the wicked, but he will because of their sin, but his intention is to bring blessing, and he's bringing that through Abraham. It's important to see that. Now, another thing to point out here in this, God is working through Abraham to restore that which was lost in the fall. Okay? What was that? Well, they were in the garden, right? They had the garden, they had the trees to manage, to steward. They had life. They had relationship with God. And God's first thing that he commands them to do is what? Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. But because of their fall in Genesis 3, they lose that. They get kicked out from God's presence, from his dwelling, all that. But here, see what God's doing is bringing this back. And he's going to do that. We're going to look at this more next time. God's doing that in a microcosm in the land of Israel. This is the land where God dwells, and God is making himself known to the world that they would know him and have what? The blessing. To know God and have this life that God's purposed from the beginning. This is to be taken out to the nations, okay? So let me pause there. Questions on that? I want you to really understand as we move forward what God's doing with Abraham, it centers in his purpose of redemption, about bringing the lost, bringing the wicked into relationship. Grace. And back to your question about grace. God wants to show grace, and he's doing that through this family, through what he's purposing and bringing about through Abraham. Questions, comments on that? Yeah. Yes, I would add to bring that in also to unpack it further. What does it mean to have a relationship with God? When he's in your life at the center, there's enrichment, there's enablement to bring about what his purposes are. So it's that too. Does that make sense? Great question. Yeah. Oh, right. The question was, how should we understand blessing? I have to keep reminding myself that. How should we understand blessing throughout the Old Testament? Is it according to this definition, or should we understand a little bit wider range? And I would say this is the core, but also understand the aspect of it being enrichment, being enablement of God's presence. It's something we don't have apart from God. That's core. Right? What's the New Testament text? Every good and perfect gift comes from God. Not from the devil, not from us, it's God. So blessing is sourced in God. So thank you, excellent question. Okay, next, the Abrahamic covenant. If you look in my notes, I have a footnote here. We're being selective. I spent 10 years of my life studying the Abrahamic covenant. There's a lot there, and I wrote a dissertation this thick on it. It's a lot, so we can't cover all that today. But as I was looking through this study on Abrahamic covenant, I learned a lot about God's character and even this issue about holy war. So in 15, we have this promise that God has made to Abraham. But Abraham is pushing back to God a bit. And it's like, okay, I'm following you. I've been following you all these years. I'm here in the land that you said you're going to give me, but I still don't have any children. And he's basically asking the questions, faith-seeking understanding. It's not that he doesn't believe God. He's like, help me understand. Help me understand how you're bringing about your purposes of land, seed, and blessing. So at this point, God responds to him in a vision and says this. Well, as the sun is going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and behold, a dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, and this is the content I want to zero in on. He tells him about his future. Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs. Remember, God's promising a land to his descendants, but your offspring that isn't yet even in existence, they're going to be in a foreign land and be sojourners there. And they will be servants there. Ooh. This isn't a happy thought. Maybe that's why at the beginning it's darkness and fear. I mean, how would you feel if God showed up to you in a dream and said, hey, your descendants that aren't yet in existence, but I'm going to bring this great nation out of you, but they're going to be oppressed. It doesn't sound like a happy thought, right? But look at what God's purposes are. Okay, continuing on. And they will be afflicted for 400 years. Verse 14. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. So God's going to bring justice to their ill treatment. That's important to see. They're going to be ill treated, but God's going to address that. As for you, Abraham, you shall go to your fathers in peace, meaning you're going to die in peace, and you shall be buried in a good old age. But then look at 16. And they, talking about who? Your future descendants, the nation that I'm going to make out of your offspring, they shall come back here. Where? Canaan, the land of Canaan. When? In the 4th generation. Now, a very important text that people miss is this next thing. Why? For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. What's that there for? It's explaining the delay. Why is God not giving Abraham and his descendants the land right at that moment? Because the current people that are in it, although they're bad, they're not yet to the level at which God is going to remove them. So some things to look at here. Oh, I mean to move ahead. Yeah.
Is that because God's trying to give them a chance to change?
Yes. Thank you. Yes. Oh, sorry. Question. The question is asked, is that because God is giving them an opportunity to change? And I'm like, yes. Yes, and that's key. That is so key, because in all these texts that are bloody and God's desire isn't to destroy people. But justice demands response to people who continue to dig in and resist God and resist the flourishing. Instead, want to live in death and misery. Okay, one other thing, and then I want to kind of tie some things together. Chapter 18, we have, let me just skip down here because it's going to take some time here. In chapter 18, we see God unpacking part of the purpose that he has for Abraham. And this is very interesting because God has a conversation with his angels here. Remember, God and two angels show up to Abraham at his tent. And after Abraham shows them hospitality and kindness, then he sends them on their way. And as they're departing, God says, shall I keep from Abraham what I'm about to do? Here in the green. What's he talking about? If you know the story, he's talking about going to Sodom and Gomorrah and obliterating these cities. And you're like, oh, that's kind of nasty. And yeah, it is. Who are these people? These people are resistant against God and his ways and doing evil beyond description. Okay? But look how God continues to unpack this. He says, shall I hold from Abraham what I'm about to do? Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all nations of the earth shall be what? Blessed in him. So we're seeing God's purpose again coming through Abraham. He's bringing blessing to the world. But part of that bringing blessing is dealing with sin and dealing with the mess in the world. You can't just like, oh, it's a happy world when that sin and death and destruction and murder happen. These people were evil and bringing ruination to others. And so continue here in verse 19. For I have chosen him for what? That he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice. This is a theme throughout the Old Testament and into the New. We seek what? Justice and righteousness. So what does God want Abraham to do? Bring justice and righteousness in his domain and teach his children to do what? Live in justice and righteousness, not leaving sin go rampant. So what's interesting here is I see this as he's giving Abraham an example of what this looks like. I think that's what's happening here. Remember, we just read that in 400 years, Abraham's descendants are going to be oppressed, but God's going to bring justice on that nation for their evil, right? For their oppressing Israelites. But that's all in the future, and Abraham doesn't see it. But here there are two cities, or actually 5 cities, but in particular Sodom and Gomorrah, who are at that point. Not like the Amorites, they've got a way to go. Sodom and Gomorrah, today's their day because of what they're doing. And so God reveals to Abraham his plans and lets Abraham in on what's happening. And you know what happens here, right? Abraham petitions God. Will not the judge of all the earth do right? And the answer is yes, he will. But he engages, he's making a petition like, what if there's 50? Will you destroy everybody? The righteous and the wicked? Surely you won't do that. And you get the answer is God's not going to do that. And it comes all the way down to 10 and then, right? But God does deliver Lot out of that city. But there's an aspect here of God's judgment that he wants Abraham to understand. So is that making sense? What he's doing here, what he's unpacking here for him? Okay. Next. Let me just highlight some points here. Back up one. So from the Abrahamic covenant, just some theological points, takeaways. God is restoring what was lost in the fall through Abraham. So land, offspring, blessing, shalom, relationship with God. Next, God will bless all families of the earth through Abraham. This is key. We see it repeated throughout, and I could give you more text if we had time. He continually emphasizes he wants to bring blessing to the nations through Abraham. We need to understand that in light of what God is doing and bringing justice as well. Next, God's people. This is a tough one, but I hope it encourages us today. Let me unpack it. This is tough. God's people suffer at the hands of the wicked. Right? Where was Israel while the Amorites were in their land? They were in Egypt, and they were suffering at the hands of Pharaoh, being oppressed, and even experiencing genocide, with their babies being slaughtered. Okay, why? And to your question, I don't know your name, sorry, but here, right? God's allowing wicked the opportunity to what? Repent. It's grace. And this spans both testaments. And the ultimate example, friends, what's the ultimate example of this? What is the greatest example of this? And why do we think that we're going to escape that? We're his followers, as we sung that last song this morning, right? Crucified with Christ. Okay, but this is the model. Next, God is just. He will bring justice at the appropriate time. That's important to understand too. How long? Is God just blind to what the situation in the world is? No. But in God's timing, at the appropriate time, he will bring justice. But we understand too, his delay goes back to the Exodus 34 passage, that he's slow to anger. He's a gracious and merciful God. But again, ultimately, the time will come. And then God expects Abraham and his descendants to exercise justice and righteousness. We saw that, right? Their nation is to be characterized by this, so much so that the other nations would look at themselves and like, we're a mess. But in Israel, they know the true God. Justice reigns there. I want that. And their God is so close to them that he answers when they call upon him. And they want that. They desire that. So God's expecting that. And God is faithful to his promises. We can take that to the bank. What he's promised, he will do. And this is going to be unfolded throughout the rest of the Bible. Let me pause here. Any questions on this? There's a lot. I know you're probably, your head's like, there's a lot here. Okay. Next, Exodus. Going to jump ahead. And I want to look at what's the situation? Well, in Exodus 1:11, we see that there's oppression. Pharaoh is oppressing the Israelites. He's oppressing them and creating a slave labor for them. But being that that's really not working and reducing the amount of people and the threat that Pharaoh sees, he takes them to genocide. And it's important to understand this as God judges Pharaoh, that what has the Egyptians and Pharaoh actually done to the Israelites? They're killing innocent people. Do you see that? And again, back to the principle, what we see? When you take someone's life, what's the punishment for that? So, genocide. He commanded the midwives to kill the baby boys at birth. And you know the story, they didn't do that because they feared God rather than Pharaoh. So, seeing that this wasn't working, he commands all the Egyptians to bring about genocide upon the Hebrews by throwing them into the Nile and drowning them. And we know that God preserves Moses through the Nile as he's in this basket. By the way, you know what the Hebrew word there for the basket is? Ark. It's the ark. It's imagery going back to the flood. He's saved. Everyone else is dying, but he's being saved for God's deliverance of his people. This is really difficult to look at. And here's what's really sad. What did God do for the Egyptians through Israel? Again, we didn't have time to get into all this. But think about Joseph. Joseph goes down there as enslaved, right? But then God uses Joseph to bring blessing to the Egyptians and all the other peoples, right? Through him giving him wisdom in how to deal with grain production and preparing for a famine. And this is how the Egyptians repay God's blessing through Israel. Do you see this? Now again, there's another Pharaoh that rose that didn't know Joseph. He didn't know the story. But he needed to do a history lesson. Okay? But he didn't. He failed. And here, God is going to bring them to account. So next, Yahweh's response. Well, he heard the cry of the Hebrews, and we see this in Exodus 2, 23 through 24. He remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, this does not mean God forgot. Like, oh yeah, I remember that I made a covenant with them. Remembered here is a covenant term of faithfulness. The point being driven home is God hasn't forgotten his people, and he remembers his covenant, and he's going to bring that to pass. So what's he do next? He raises up a deliverer, Moses. Exodus 2 through 4. Now, this is interesting. As you read this text, some difficult passages here, right? With Moses first, well, I want to ask this. How is Moses presented in the text? You have 80 years of his life that's covered in a few chapters. 80 years. Why these stories? Him being delivered through the genocide, him slaying the taskmaster, and then being a fugitive, and then he goes out into the desert. Okay, I'm going to tell you why. It's because the narrator is presenting him as a deliverer. Okay, he's delivered through the genocide, but then he sees a taskmaster abusing, enslaving, beating a fellow Israelite, and he brings justice. Okay, now you can ask the question about his righteousness in that, but what I'm presenting is he's being presented as one who stands up for justice. Because what's the very next thing we see him doing? He goes out into the desert fleeing for his life, and he meets some shepherdesses, right? And they're giving water to their flocks, and then these other shepherds come in and start beating up on them. What does Moses do? He delivers the women. He's a deliverer because it's unjust how these shepherds are treating the women. So he's being presented in that way. Next, God then engages in battle with Pharaoh and the Egyptian gods. We see this from 5 through 15, chapters 5 through 15. All right, I want to look at a text here in Exodus 6 that helps put some pieces together here. So this is after God has called, after he's called Moses to go and deliver his people out of Egypt. But here he says, but the Lord said to Moses, now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh, for with a strong hand he will send them out, and with a strong hand he will drive them out of his land. Pointing out God's going to deliver his people, bringing them out, and he's going to work in Pharaoh's life to actually get him to release them. So then God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty, but by my name Yahweh I did not make myself known to them. I also established my covenant. There's connecting back to the covenant, okay? My covenant with them to give them what? The land of Canaan, the land in which they lived as sojourners. Moreover, I have heard the groaning of the people of Israel, whom the Egyptians hold as slaves, and I have remembered my covenant. So back to what we just learned about in Genesis 15, God said, this is going to happen, but I'm going to bring judgment and deliver my people out of that land and bring them back here to this land, because it's through you I'm going to bring blessing to all peoples. Next, say therefore to the people of Israel, I am Yahweh, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from the slavery to them. Okay, let me pause there. This is the key event in Israel's life. For us, we look to the cross, and to Israelites, they look to the cross in light of the work that God's done. But for Israel, this is that key salvific event where God brings justice upon their oppressors, and he makes them into a nation, makes them into his people. And continuing on here, what? I will redeem you with an outstretched arm with great acts of judgment, and I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God. And you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who has brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. And I will bring you into the land that I swore to give to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and to Jacob. And I will give you it as a possession. I am the Lord. Moses spoke thus to the people, but they did not listen to him. Okay. But here, what do we see is God is being faithful to his promise to bring the people out of Egypt, bring them to the land, deliver them out of slavery. And this is key for their life and who they are as a people. The Ten Commandments begins with this statement, right? The first commandment really begins with, I brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. I'm your God, my people. So you see that relationship of redemption. He's bringing them back into relationship with himself. Now, I want to talk, here as we get near the end for today, I want to talk about the Egyptian war imagery here, because we've got holy war, we've got Yahweh war going on, and we have this phrase throughout the text, outstretched arm, or a strong hand, and you can look at the references here. Jim Hoffmeyer, who's an Egyptologist, who's an evangelical Christian, great guy. We went to Egypt, my wife and I, Michelle, we went to Egypt with him back in 2019. And he's done some work with this imagery, because what's interesting in Egypt, let me show you this, here's a picture. It's hard to see. You can't see it from there. Throughout Egypt, you see this imagery of the Pharaoh reaching his hand out and grabbing his enemy with his one hand, and the other hand he has a mace or a weapon to smash his enemy. And it's throughout. It's a warning. And here you have Pharaoh on the one side here. You see his hands raised, and he's gripping his enemies here. On the other side of this pylon, you have the same image with Pharaoh raising his arm to smash his enemies. What God is doing is taking that imagery and saying, you are being unjust to my people, beating my people. I am going to come and discipline you. And that imagery, again, is throughout. This outstretched arm It's God's delivering arm. Here's another picture. You can maybe see a little better here. It's a close-up of that same image I gave you on the left side, on the right side. Here, it's hard to see, but the enemies here have long hair. The Semites, they have long hair, and he's gripping a bunch of them. He's clustering them in his hand, and then here to strike them into submission is the idea. So God picks up on this imagery to describe him, because what has Pharaoh done? Pharaoh has taken the place of God. Pharaoh says, I'm God. I'm the true king. I'm the creator. Remember whenever Moses goes and speaks to Pharaoh? I don't know Yahweh, and neither will I listen to him. So God makes himself known through the plagues. But even there, notice this, God just doesn't do it in one moment. There's grace. He has 10 plagues to learn his lesson, but he continues to harden his heart. Let me just address another question that comes up. But doesn't it say God's going to harden his heart? So God just wanted to mess with Pharaoh, right? No. What you see is God doesn't harden Pharaoh's heart until Pharaoh hardens his own heart. And then God's like, okay, you made your decision. I'm going to still use you for my glory. So there's that aspect there. And there's more to discuss on that. But I think it's important to notice that, again, because God's not desiring just to destroy people, but he is interested in justice and that. So here's another picture of it too. Okay, let me pause here. We have 7 minutes left. But any questions on the imagery of Pharaoh and what's going on in these texts about how God is being portrayed, taking that image as an outstretched arm? Deliverer. Okay. Let's go on to this. We'll wrap up with this today, the Song of the Sea. And I want to throw something out to you as we talk about this. Today with our worship music, there's much lacking in a lot of popular Christian worship music today. I've long been trying to emphasize to people to look to the songs in Scripture as a model and how they portray God, and God is the focus, and what God has done, his acts of creation, his acts of deliverance, his acts of redemption, putting the focus on God. Yes, we are the benefactor, but God needs to be center. And we'll see that in this song, okay, which talks about God as warrior, defeating his enemies, delivering Israel as he had promised, and bringing about their redemption. Ultimately for what? To bring about redemption for the entire world is where we're headed. Okay, so Exodus 15. Just want to quickly read through this. Then Moses and the people of Israel sang this song to the Lord. They sang this, saying what? I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. This image of what happened at the Exodus with the waters being parted, right? The Lord is my strength and my song, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him. My Father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a man of war. The Lord is his name. Not a Lord of war, not a man of war of evil like Putin, okay? But of war of bringing justice and delivering the oppressed, okay? That idea. We have to have that correct understanding. One more thing here too. I'll get there in a second. We'll continue on. Pharaoh's chariots and his host he cast into the sea, and his chosen officers were sunk in the Red Sea. The floods covered them. They went down to the depths like a stone. Your right hand. See the imagery? O Lord, glorious in power. Your right hand, O Lord, shatters the enemy. See the imagery? And again, let me put you into context. Israel, as slaves in Egypt, have experienced the oppression of Egypt, right? What have they seen everywhere around them? These images. Don't rise up. God comes to deliver his people out of the mess that they're in. Okay? Now, another thing. He cast them into the sea. What kind of imagery? Why is it that God chose to destroy the Egyptians in the Red Sea? Now, I can't answer that question fully, but I got a hunch. Why? Creator. What's God do in creation? Second day, pushes the water back. Sorry, the third day. Messed up. The third day. And what happens? Lets the dry land appear. When God pushes the water back, they walk on mud, dry land. So that they would understand what? It's none other than the Creator who's doing this work. Okay? You got to look at that imagery there. It's just beautiful to see that. And then crushes. That's what? The flood? Do you understand that the flood in Genesis 6 is a reversal of creation? That's what it is. It goes back to Genesis 1:2. But one difference. There's an ark that's preserving life. But what's happened? The waters from above, the waters from below have crushed the land and wiped out humanity. Here, the waters come and crush the wicked. It's that same imagery. It's this theme going throughout. Okay, continue on. In the greatness of your majesty, you overthrow your adversaries. You send out your fury, it consumes them like stubble. At the blast of your nostrils, the waters pile up. Again, creation imagery. The floods stood up like a heap. The depths congealed in the heart of the sea. The enemy said, I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide the spoil. My desire shall have its full of them. Do you see what's going on with Egypt? Oh, we're going to take them. We want them. We want to use them for our purposes. God's like, I will draw the sword. My hand shall destroy them. But you blew with your wind, and the sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mighty waters. Who is like you, O Yahweh, among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in your glorious deeds, doing wonders? You stretched out your right hand, and the earth swallowed them. Creator. You have led in your steadfast love the people whom you have redeemed. You have guided them by your strength to your holy abode. His presence, to know him. The peoples have heard, they tremble. Pangs have seized the inhabitants of Philistia. Now the chiefs of Edom are dismayed. Trembling seizes the leaders of Moab. All the inhabitants of Canaan have melted away. But notice his redemption here that's being discussed. Terror and dread fall upon them because of the greatness of your arm. They are still as like a stone till your people, O Lord, pass by, till the people pass by whom you have purchased. Redemption. You will bring them in and plant them on your mountain, the place. O Lord, which you have made for your abode, the sanctuary. O Lord, which your hands have established. The Lord will reign forever and ever. So again, it's graphic, it's uneasy, but we need to look at this, friends, as God bringing justice upon the wicked and letting what? Justice and righteousness reign. Okay? And we'll conclude with this. Last slide. So in the Exodus, God is portraying what? Well, his faithfulness to his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Next, his superiority to Pharaoh and the Egyptian gods through the battle, Yahweh war, showing that he is the true God, creator, and king. It's demonstrating that. Another text I don't have listed there, but write down Exodus 12:12. This text presents the context. It's God is executing judgment on the Egyptian gods because they're claiming to be God and they're not. Next, his justice. Again, paying the perpetrators for what they've done against God and his people. His glory is displayed. You saw that in the song. Wow, the gloriousness of God, who he is. We're amazed by him. His power, his strength, right, is displayed in power over the sea, over the armies that are opposing him. And his mercy. Even in the battle, it's merciful. Why? Because he's showing grace to his people by delivering them out of there. Okay, we're basically out of time. But I hope this has been helpful. Any questions, comments as we wrap up? Yeah.
So thinking back to Genesis 15, God told Abraham it was going to be 400 years in slavery. Is there any indication anyone was actually watching for a deliverer?
Oh, good question. I want to look into that more in that, let me answer your question. The question. The question was, is there any indication in the Bible that someone was looking for a deliverer based on what was predicted of 400 years? Yes. Yes, they knew God. The midwives knew God is what the comment was. We do have in the text later that it says to the very day, referencing 430 years, to the very day they left, which is kind of amazing to that point, but not like foretelling that someone actually saw it. However, I will point out this. This was being carried down through the years of this hope based on what God had said to the patriarchs. Well, what would be some evidence of that? Joseph. Okay, one of the things I was talking about in my class, we spend half a class or more on burial. Like, that's very morbid. But the burial of these Israelites showed their hope in God and his promises and their faith in God. Think about Joseph. Remember, whenever he's about to die, he makes his brothers and family swear to him that what? I'm going to be buried, I'm going to be entombed, I'm going to be embalmed, mummified here in Egypt, but when God comes, you dig me out and take me to the land because that's my inheritance. My inheritance isn't here in Egypt. It's something for us to learn too, by the way. This isn't our home. But that burial pointed out. So guess what? Whenever the Exodus happens, before they leave, go and get Joseph's bones. So that would have been carried down through. How would they have known that? And so they're looking forward. I will say that. I think the text is clear on that. The actual day, maybe not so much, but they are looking forward to that day knowing this isn't their home and God's going to bring them to the promised land and bring about these promises that he's said to them. Yeah. 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 Oh, yeah, because he indicts them. Christ indicts them for not knowing the day, which we'll just be looking at in a couple weeks. When Christ comes in, he weeps over Jerusalem and basically says, if you'd only known the time of your visitation, but you would not. And now you're going to be torn down. The judgment that's coming. Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? It was a heavy one. I realized that. A lot of stuff. You have more questions after. I'll be here for a little bit afterwards if you have any other questions. Thank you. Look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. All right. Have a good day.